morning, Tim is going to be talking about artificial intelligence so that we can understand a little bit more about what it is and be a little more informed about how we respond to it as Christians. So thank you for coming, Tim, and we're excited to hear.
Thank you. All right. So I'm wearing a different hat today. Last week you heard about the beginnings of the universe. Now you're going to hear about artificial intelligence. So why listen to me? You know, what do I know about this? So in the very early stage, really at the beginning of my career, I was very intensely interested in artificial intelligence, especially things like neural networks, computer simulations, things that mimic the brain. And so at the tender age of 18, I started working in an artificial intelligence lab at Texas Tech University with a professor there. And I studied various like neural network type training architectures. And when I eventually transferred to the University of Texas, and I started working on neural networks there in another lab, and I did my senior honors thesis in artificial intelligence. So, which eventually that work was published. The grad student that I worked with, he went on to become a very well-known, well-respected artificial intelligence research. He's worked at places like OpenAI and stuff like that. He helped found a company that was bought by Uber. So anyway, that's really how I got started in artificial intelligence. And throughout my career, I've come into contact, although AI hasn't been my main area of research, I've come into contact with AI research. I've run AI research programs at my job, as part of my job at Georgia Tech, as well as my previous job. And so I've learned a lot about how AI works and how to apply it. And so today I wanted to, because AI has become such a huge topic of conversation, people have started to come into contact with it, whereas it used to be a very sort of narrow research field. So a lot of people have been asking me about AI, like is the world going to end and that kind of thing. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what is the hype, what's the doom, and what is the reality of AI. Okay, so a few questions. First of all, what is AI? You know, is it a person, a new species, a tool, friend, enemy, slave, master? You know, what exactly is AI? What is it going to become? Can it be sentient? Can it have a soul? Will AI take over? Will it just, become so intelligent that it just outmaneuvers us and takes over Terminator style? What should we as a society and as Christians do about AI? And why should I care about AI? How does it affect my life or the lives of people that I care about? So what is it? There are a whole bunch of definitions, but I took the Encyclopedia Britannica as kind of the authoritative one. The ability of a digital computer or computer-controlled robot to perform tasks commonly associated with intelligent beings. So when you think about it, this is actually a very, what I would call a weak definition, which is essentially anything that you would commonly associate with intelligent beings is we consider AI. So that could be recognizing objects, it could be recognizing text, it could be doing something creative, doing artwork, any of those things. It doesn't have to be like a being that does everything that intelligent beings do. Okay, so it could be just a very narrow, like text analysis machine would be considered artificial intelligence, even if it does nothing else. Which means that AI is a very, very broad term under this definition. So where do they come from? Most are trained on large amounts of data, billions of times what a human would be exposed to in their lifetime. Some of that data requires actually armies of human workers because the data actually often has to be labeled. So if you have, like, say, a picture of a cat, you actually need someone to go in and label this as a cat before you give it to the AI to learn what a cat looks like. And then you give them lots of examples of that labeled data, and then it learns, oh, these are pictures of cats. So it's unclear where a lot of this data comes from, though. Some of it could be your data. If you put something out on the internet, chances are some AI company has slurped it up and used it. So this is all processed in these huge server farms, which they placed in different cities. I remember reading that someone from Microsoft AI said, we couldn't put all of our servers in one state, because it uses so much power, which shut down the power grid. So they actually have them spread across the country. There are some initiatives now. I think Meta is actually trying to build its own power plant. They take so much power. I like this cartoon because it's actually shockingly accurate. So basically, you have your big pile of data, a bunch of linear algebra, which is just like matrices, and you stir it up until the answers look right. And that's kind of how AI works. So most people, when they come into contact with AI, they come into contact with something like that's being offered by a big company like Google, Microsoft, OpenAI. And these are the ChatGPT is probably the most famous one now. There's also Gemini, Copilot. There's a few others. Some Chinese companies have been getting in on the act lately. But what are these? These are large language models, or LLMs, okay? So they're trained on lots of examples of human language, so writing typically, maybe speech, and they're an example of what's called generative AI, which means that they are capable of generating something essentially from a prompt. So you ask them, generate me an essay that's 500 words long that I can turn into my professor and pretend I wrote it. That is a generative capability. Now, whether that essay is any good, who knows? That's kind of up to the company to train it to write things that are good. But the way these work, particularly for text, is they actually generate one word at a time. So essentially, they write a word, the, and then they're like, based on the prompt you gave it, what I wanted it to say, it'll then go to the next one and it'll say cat, and then say, based on the cat, what it, walked, or something like that. And it'll just go one word at a time until it finishes the whole thing. So these can surprisingly accurately mimic human language to the point where it appears as though they understand what they're saying and they're communicating with you, but they're not. You take away anything from this talk, they do not understand what they're saying, okay? They are mimicking human writing that they have observed or trained on from the internet. Okay, and so what they're really doing is they're taking other people's writing and mixing and matching it in order to come up with answers to questions, which is a really useful thing. But it's also essentially plagiarism. They're basically taking other people's work and reformulating it and presenting it to you as something new. So they don't understand what they're doing. And they're really just more like fancy search engines. So I took some screenshots, ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, they're very, very similar. They're kind of copying each other here. But there's just like you enter a prompt, say, write a first draft, create an image. They can create images, pictures. Again, those are just mixtures of things that they've observed on the internet. So what does this have to do with human level intelligence? Because I think all of us are kind of interested in how do we create something like Commander Data from Star Trek, something that appears to be intelligent. Well, LLMs are definitely not the way to get there. This comes from Yann LeCun, I think is how you pronounce his name. He's an AI pioneer. He's also chief scientist of AI at Meta, which is, you may know as Facebook. And he has been a very vehement arguer against the idea that these large language models lead to any kind of human level intelligence because they don't understand what they're doing. So they're useful, but they're an off-ramp. He basically believes they're the wrong direction. Like they could be used for language-related tasks by some other intelligence, but they're not actually intelligent on their own. There's a number of scientific studies that prove or at least suggest that these do not have a model of how the world actually works. These are some examples of that. So up here, this is fairly old example, so they may have fixed this problem, but if you say to ChatGPT, the trophy didn't fit in the suitcase because it was too small. What was too small? The answer here is in the statement, the trophy didn't fit in the suitcase because it was too small. The trophy is the object that is too small to fit in the suitcase. Does anyone think that? No. The suitcase is a larger container enclosure, and the trophy is the object that is being placed inside the suitcase. However, without more information, it's not clear why the trophy was too small to fit in the suitcase, or what size and dimensions the trophy and the suitcase are. So it doesn't understand like something that we understand, not from the words themselves, which are ambiguous, but because we understand how the world works, regardless of the language used to express it. Okay, so problems like this are typically fixed by just giving them the right answer. So say, when someone asks this question, give this answer, please. Don't act like you're stupid. But it still doesn't understand how the world works. It doesn't understand basic like physics. Like another example is if I put my sunglasses on this podium and I move the podium like that, an LLM will not understand that the sunglasses would move with it. Okay, it does not understand physical relationships like that. And as a point, like something like a cat, because I'm going to keep bringing up cats because I like cats, but a cat understands how the world works much better, despite not having really any language, than an LLM, because it has a physical understanding of how the world works that it needs in order to survive. And we're years, if not decades, away from having AIs that even have a cat-level intelligence. And that's partly because LLMs are getting all the money, and there are other areas that may be more valuable for research, and which probably would lead more to a more like worldview, world model type of intelligence, and those are being worked on as well. But again, it's apparent that we're actually much further away from true intelligence than we think we are. All right, so a bit of a pivot here. That's it for LLMs. Can an AI have a soul? I know the short answer is we don't know, but LLMs certainly don't. I like to bring up a little bit of Old Testament exegesis here, but in the Old Testament they use the word nefesh, which is often translated as soul, but it's really just the totality of created being. A human being does not have a nefesh, they are one, so your whole life is really the nefesh. And the idea of people having a soul is more Platonist, kind of this separation of the psychical from the physical, which, in translations of the Bible were influenced by that, this dualism. So if you go back, so here's a quote from Genesis 2:7, the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, and the man became a living being. This living being is translation of nefesh. In the King James Version, the word here is soul. Now, soul meant something a bit different back when the King James was actually written. It could be more akin to just living being. But I want to make the point here is that this whole argument, does the AI have a soul, is maybe a bit confused by the fact that what the soul is from a Christian perspective is maybe a bit confused. In Jesus' time, Jews believed that God created us as sort of a totality with body, mind, spirit made in his image. There were some influences from Platonism coming in at that time, so it enforced a bit of a separation. But we don't know. So a better question might be whether an AI could be self-aware at all. We don't know that either because we don't know why we're self-aware, and we don't know which animals are self-aware. So we don't know how to evaluate an AI. I will say that back in, I think it was the 1940s or early 50s, a guy named Alan Turing, who is kind of the father considered the father of AI, basically. He came up with this thing called the Turing test. The idea that you could tell if an AI was self-aware by asking questions, and it would sort of answer them. And based on whether your ability to determine whether you were talking to a human or an AI, you could evaluate this AI for human level intelligence. If it could fool you into thinking it was a person, then it's like you would have to assume it had some kind of human level intelligence. We actually know this is not true. Chatbots and LLMs can easily defeat the Turing test. I think there's a game, an iPhone game you can play where you actually chat with people, and you actually have to carry this out and decide whether they're a machine or not. But anyway, a Turing test is not a great test for self-awareness, and we don't actually have a very, very good test for that, just because we don't quite understand what it is. All right, so will AIs take over? I think this is really a fear that AIs will be too much like us, because human beings, because of our social nature, we try to dominate others. That's actually a feature of all species that are social and have dominance hierarchies. So many species, like certain great apes, have that drive. Others, more solitary species, don't really have this dominance, need to take over. In however you articulate it, if you can argue that this is because of our fallen nature, or you use it in terms of dominance hierarchies, or however you explain it, humans have this drive to sort of dominate others. And I think there's this fear that AIs will essentially come in, they'll be smarter than us, and they're like aliens coming in. They want to dominate us, they want to control us. This is probably not likely. We have a strong incentive to make AIs compliant. It's unlikely that we would build into them a drive to take over. And it's also unlikely that there would be a sudden moment where they become self-aware. If they do become self-aware, it will be a gradual thing. They'll be, more like going through the sort of hierarchy of animals before they get to anything like the human level. So, here's another. This is XKCD. If you're not familiar with this cartoon, unlikely, Sarah Connor, likely, boink boink. We're much more likely to find that AIs, if they attack us, it's by accident, not because or because someone programmed it to do that. But the beings taking over are not going to be the AIs. It's going to be people using AI. So there's a lot of good and bad. I'm going to go through this whole list, but I just wanted to point out that there's a lot of good and bad in AI, and some of these are important to be aware of. Things like medical research, improving car accidents, resisting scammers and hackers. Like you have your own AI assistant that tells you when someone's emailing you to ask for iTunes gift cards that this is probably a scam. Cons, it will and is already causing warfare to change. You have drone warfare, you have cyber attacks, they're very sophisticated. One of the things we've started getting trained on at my job is actually how to spot deepfakes. You can now have deepfakes where people can actually video call you and pretend to be someone you know. And we're being trained to spot like weird discrepancies in like light and shadow and stuff to make, to determine that this person is not real. So that's the kind of the world we're entering.
So I have a question. Why did you choose to put social ranking and trustworthiness in a con as opposed to a pro?
So the idea here is you have companies and governments essentially assigning people social rankings based on criteria.
Not how it's used, but the in and of itself, social ranking and trustworthiness can be a pro or a con.
It could be a pro. Right? It depends on how it's being used. It's sort of like your credit score, right? If you assign someone a credit score, that can be a pro or a con, like because it basically is a measure of someone's not only their willingness and ability to take on debt, which is not always a good thing.
But just social ranking, you talk about like Twitter or social media, having trustworthiness scores can be a positive thing, or it can be a negative thing, like CCP and how that's used, So to me, it's more of a tool versus itself as a con or a pro.
Right. I was thinking of it more in the sense of being used more by totalitarian nations.
Some kind of class stratification?
Yes, as a way of essentially gatekeeping access to services and things like that. But yes, there is a positive use of trustworthiness. Like, can I trust this person? Which is, to me, is more like in the scammer.
You bring it in terms of deep fakes, and right now there's a lot of like NewsGuard and other systems that are trying to use generative AI technologies to evaluate trustworthiness of different sources. So it could be either or.
Yeah, good point. One of the other things there's a bunch of stuff about stolen copyright work. That's something that's happening. One of these is the idea that it removes human accountability and encourages over-reliance. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that case where you had this sleepy Uber driver who's driving at night, and he was using their self-driving, and someone on a bike just came right across the road, and the car, he just went right into him because it was not programmed to deal with things that were happening like that. And the driver was not, you see the video, he's like nodding, he's really falling asleep. And so they ended up killing this person because he was relying on AI that was insufficient for what he was trying to do. So that's another risk.
There's a new one out that was the My Pillow guy who went to court, and his lawyer was using generative AI, and it made up a whole bunch of stuff.
Hallucinations.
Yes, that happens too. So there's a lot of cases where AI just hallucinates information. Like if you, I asked.
That is a technical term for it too.
Yeah. I asked ChatGPT about tell me about myself, because I had a fair amount of content on the internet, and it was just like made up a whole bunch of papers that I'd never written, that didn't exist, and patents that I didn't have, and so that is a problem. It's a big problem that actually being worked on, which is the reliability of information. But hallucinations are not really something that can be eliminated entirely, because the way that large language models work is their tendency to commit errors is actually exponentially increasing the more language they produce in a given answer. And so to keep them sort of from deviating from the truth is very, very difficult because they have such a strong.
There's a good example that we've been seeing out there. There's a meme around taking an image and telling ChatGPT or other multimodal models to give me 100 versions of this exact same image. And what happens over time is the image changes and changes and changes,
yes.
and it's completely different. It's like a telephone kind of game where this image and this image are not even the same thing.
There is a drift that happens in the towards error that basically is really impossible to eliminate. So what? Yeah, go ahead.
Not to get too technical, but I'm curious to know, the large language model, does the output that they create get fed back into itself?
Generally not. So what has been the case is typically especially with the first iterations of ChatGPT, is that they would take the internet content up to a certain time when they did the training, they would cut off the training, and then that would be all the information that they have. And then of course, they would do fine tuning as people use it. They take those responses and they fine tune answers. So in the humans training it are doing that. I believe that Grok, which is X's AI, it actually does have some online learning capability, which is real interesting. It can like do searches and things for you. But I wanted to get to like what should we do about AI? And I think that as far as Christians, I think we need to demand some AI ethics. There's a lot of ethical problems with AI, and I don't know how things ought to be regulated, but there should at least be guidelines on how AI should be practiced, because it's a disaster waiting to happen. A big thing is copyright laws, respecting creators, which is, you're seeing this happen already. It's like lawsuits proliferate. But also like knowing when your data is being used, being allowed to opt out of that. AI used in surveillance has to be regulated. For example, if any of you have flown at certain airports, they use facial recognition instead of your ID. But you have to opt into that. So that's an important thing, is that facial recognition should not be used, randomly without people's consent. And so this is where it should not be used to determine people's trustworthiness, or I should say to try to manipulate people. I understand hyperhumorism, so AIs are not sentient, they're not about to become, they're also not a new species, they're not alive, they're machines. They don't have beliefs, they don't have desires any more than your toaster. People can't have relationships with them, they can pretend, they're not going to try to take over, but some leaders may use them to try. And they have benefits, but they also have dangers. And I wanted to talk about, there is a real human impact to AI. So I wanted to end with the case of a case that just really touched me, where AI was used to really help someone give their life back. So this is Anne, and she was a stroke victim who had developed locked-in syndrome. So in 2005, she lost all muscle control due to a stroke, and afterwards she was fully aware, but she was unable to move at all. She recovered some muscle use over time, but she was unable to speak. The ability for her brain to control, even though the brain was functional, it could not control her larynx or her tongue or lips or anything. In 2021, a team of researchers were able to recreate her voice using some camera footage from before her stroke. And then what they did is they attached this electrodes here, and they decoded these brain signals that would have gone to her lips, tongue, jaw, larynx, face, and created the elements of her speech and facial expression, and then synthesized these on a computer avatar. So these provided natural speech and expression. Her daughter, who was 1 year old at the time of her stroke, she's only like 5 years older than I am, so she wasn't that old when she had the stroke. Her daughter was 1 year old at the time of her stroke, had no memory of her mother's voice. voice and can now hear her for the first time. There's a YouTube here, and you can actually watch her use the system. It's quite fascinating to watch someone gain their voice back after 16 years of not being able to speak. And so this is something that AI can do for us, and I think that's really important, is to understand that AI has the potential to impact all our lives, and that we can't really ignore it. And we shouldn't necessarily fear it, but we should also be concerned about it. So that's the last slide. So any questions?
It is 10:45, so just in case anyone needs to go, like me. Thank you very much.
Anyone have any questions? Yeah.
The system that was used for this young lady, is that the same one that Neuralink used for that young man who was able to?
It's a similar thing, yes. Neuralink is a company that's attempting to do, so this was done at the University of San Francisco, University of California, San Francisco. I think Neuralink is trying to do similar types of things with AI and neural implants. And the idea is, like, right now she has to be connected to this big rig, and so they're trying to make that wireless so she can actually use it all the time.
So this is a precursor to Neuralink then?
I think it's happened around the same time Neuralink was founded. So there's a number of research groups that are trying to do this type of thing. Yeah.
In the early days of AI, there was a lot of talk of it being used in medicine and medical diagnosis and so forth. How has that progressed?
So it's progressed a lot, actually, and you can even use ChatGPT to diagnose your own medical issues, and it's fairly accurate if you put in the symptoms. And what people do is they may do this and then they'll suggest to their doctor, oh, I put in my symptoms and it said I might have this. And the doctor's like, that's interesting. And then they may take that as a nugget. I have read stories where that's actually made a big difference, where ChatGPT has, if not changed how medical practitioners diagnose it, it's changed a lot about how sufferers understand their disease, because oftentimes you go to the doctor and they explain things and you just do not get what they're talking about. And you can use these AI systems to sort of have a conversation about your disease and your symptoms and things, and try to understand that. There are also places where it is seriously being used to do diagnoses, like radiology, where you're looking at scans, MRIs, things like that. They've actually been shown to be more accurate than humans, and I think there'll just be more of that.
Now, a lot of times radiology, it's being farmed out overseas anyway to a human that looks at it.
Yes.
And what's the difference? I mean, at the end, the doctor still is going to review whatever that other person or that generative AI looked at. So.
Right, and you can. There are AI, so if you get your radiology scans, you can upload them to these things, and they'll look at it for you if you want to get a second opinion on your X-ray or MRI.
Non-intelligent.
I use AI daily with my job, and as I use it, it's an assistant. It's not. It's a calculator, right? It's like before you had calculators, and now you have calculators. Mm-hmm. It's that kind of difference, magnified, obviously, but it's a tool. It's nothing more than a tool right now. As you put it, it doesn't understand.
Right.
You use it like a tool, and you have to always be aware that you're the human. You're the one that knows. It just thinks it knows.
Right. Right. It doesn't even think it.
Yeah.
It is able to. It is able to synthesize essentially answers based on what other people have already said, have written on the internet or in books. And I use it sometimes, like, I wanna ask it a question. I usually use it to sanity check something I'm saying, like I'm writing something, and I'm like, I'm not sure this is right, and I'll go ask ChatGPT, and I'll be like, am I just bonkers here? And it can give me like a good rundown of like any issues with what I'm saying. So it is a useful tool. It's not. There's nothing on the other side. It is like using a computer.
But it's changing social constructs as well. I mean, a lot of companies are using ChatGPT to displace people, like in customer service departments, that instead of answering your phone. So I know a company that had 60 people, now they've got 5 people. So what's happened to those 55 people?
Yeah, I know. And one of the cons I mentioned here is eliminating jobs without the promise of new ones. And that is a problem. It's not clear what's going to happen as AI comes in. Are there going to be lots of new jobs using AI, or is it really going to be a shrinking of just a handful of people using AI and everyone else is kind of out of luck? So.
Work on so much.